Picture this. You are standing at the edge of the known world. Behind you, thousands of miles of blood-soaked earth. Every inch it conquered, every city burned or bowed. Your sandals have touched soil that no Greek boot ever touched before. The mountains ahead are higher than anything your gods ever described. The rivers run wider than your hometown. And the man riding the front of this whole unstoppable machine, the man who built this empire with nothing but nerve and a cavalry charge, that man just told every single soldier in his army to shut their mouths. Not in battle, not during a ritual. He told them to stop speaking their own language, forever. And here's the kicker. Nobody, not one general, not one veteran who had been riding since the campaign started, said a word back, because they couldn't, because the order was already in effect. That right there, my friend, is the moment the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen started dying from the inside out, and nobody saw it coming, not even the man who gave the order. You are watching Sinister Empires. And if you are new here, do yourself a solid and smash that subscribe button right now, because we do not do fluffy history on this channel. We dig into the dark, the twisted, the power moves that rewrote civilization. And today we're going all the way back to 324 BC, when Alexander III of Macedon, the man history called the Great, made one decision so arrogant, so deeply out of pocket, that it fractured the loyalty of 60,000 battle-hardened soldiers overnight. This is the story of the Opis Mutiny, the language ban, and the chain reaction that did not just crack Alexander's army, it cracked Alexander himself. So let's get into it. To understand what happened, you got to understand who these men were. The soldiers that marched with Alexander were not random conscripts rounded up from villages and handed a spear. These were Macedonians, born fighters, men raised in a military culture so hardwired into their identity that farming and soldiering were basically the same thing. The Macedonian phalanx was the deadliest ground unit the ancient world had ever produced. These dudes did not just follow Alexander. They built him. His father, Philip II, created the machine, but these soldiers, they handed it to Alexander like a loaded weapon and said, "Go ahead, King, show us what you got." And he delivered. Oh man, did he deliver. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, battle after battle. These men punched through Persian armies that outnumbered them sometimes 10-1. They marched through desert heat that would cook a man alive. They fought in mountain passes so narrow that a wrong step meant a 1,000-foot drop. They bled for this king, buried their brothers for this king, watched their friends get cut down in places whose names they could barely pronounce. All because Alexander had this energy around him, this vibe that made every man who rode beside him feel like they were part of something bigger than anything that had ever existed. The bond between Alexander and his men was not just military loyalty. It was personal. It was almost spiritual. He ate what they ate. He slept in the same conditions. He took arrows to the shoulder, swords to the thigh, and he kept moving. When his men were thirsty on a brutal march through the Gedrosian desert, one of the most punishing stretches of terrain in the ancient world, and a soldier brought him water in a helmet, Alexander poured it into the sand, right in front of everyone. Because if his men couldn't drink, he wasn't drinking either. That is the kind of leader we are talking about. That is the kind of trust these men place in him. So when Alexander started to change, the men noticed. And what happened at Opis was not just a mutiny about being sent home or being replaced by Persian soldiers. It went way deeper than that. It was about something that soldiers fight for before they fight for land, before they fight for gold, before they fight for glory. It was about identity. It was about who they were, and who Alexander was slowly, deliberately forcing them to stop being. Let's back this thing up even further, because the story of the language ban does not start at Opis. It starts the moment Alexander walked into Persepolis and did not just conquer it. He fell in love with it, and that, right there, is where the first crack appeared. When Alexander's army rolled into Persia, they came as conquerors. They came with Macedonian steel and Greek arrogance, with the philosophy of Aristotle rattling around in Alexander's head and the fire of Achilles in his chest. But Persia was not just an enemy. Persia was a world. It had libraries, palaces, court rituals, bureaucratic systems, and a culture of governance so sophisticated that it made Macedonia look like a frontier outpost by comparison. And Alexander, this kid who'd been raised on Homer, who had literally slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, walked into that world and got completely and utterly seduced by it. He started wearing Persian robes, at first just in private, just for diplomatic meetings, just to make the local administrators feel comfortable. His generals let it slide, but then he started wearing them in public. Then he started adopting the Persian court ceremony called proskynesis, a deep bow of submission that Persian subjects performed before their king. Alexander wanted his Macedonian generals to do the same. And let me tell you something. Asking a Macedonian general to bow to anybody the way a Persian subject bows to a god king was like asking a New York cab driver to salute traffic. It just was not happening. Callisthenes, Alexander's own court historian and a student of Aristotle himself, flat out refused. And Alexander, who loved and respected this man, eventually had him arrested and executed. Over a bow, over a gesture. That tells you everything about where this man's head was at. But even all of that, the robes, the bowing, the Persian ceremony, even all of that his men could stomach, because Alexander was still their king, still their general, still a man who had never lost a battle. They chalked it up to strategy, to politics. He's playing the Persian game to keep the locals in line. They told themselves he's being smart. Then came Susa, and the mass wedding that changed everything. In 324 BC, Alexander threw the most extraordinary party the ancient world had ever seen. At the city of Susa, in the heart of the former Persian Empire, he organized a mass wedding on a scale so wild, so audacious, so absolutely extra that modern historians still argue about how many people were involved. The general count goes somewhere around 90 of Alexander's highest-ranking officers, 90 men, all married off in a single ceremony to daughters of Persian and Median nobility. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses on the same day. Hephaestion, his closest companion, and the man many historians believe was his actual soulmate, married another. The entire event lasted 5 days. There were thousands of guests, an ocean of food and wine entertainment that reportedly included every kind of performer you could imagine, and gifts so expensive that the total cost reportedly ran into thousands of talent of silver. Now on the surface you might look at this and say, okay, that a power move, a political strategy, a way to bind the Persian elite to the Macedonian ruling class through blood and marriage. And you would be right. That was absolutely part of it. Alexander understood dynastic politics the way a grandmaster understands a chessboard. But here's the thing, and this is what the history books sometimes gloss over. Almost every single one of those 90 officers hated every second of it. These were Macedonian men. Men who had spent a decade in the field, away from home, away from their own families, their own women, their own culture. And now their king, was telling them to take Persian wives, to start Persian families, to plant roots in foreign soil as if Macedonia was just some distant memory they needed to let go of. It felt like a betrayal, not of their military duty, but of their entire world. And the regular soldiers, the common infantry, the cavalry riders, the siege engineers, the 10,000 men who had been fighting since the beginning of this campaign, they were not even invited to the main ceremony. They were watching from the outside, and what they saw looked less like strategy and more like their king trading them in for a newer, shinier version of an empire. But even this, even the mass wedding, was not the match that lit the fire. The match was what came right after it. Because in the weeks following the Susa weddings, Alexander announced something that hit his Macedonian veterans like a bucket of cold water straight to the face. He announced that he was releasing the older and injured veterans from service, sending them home. And that sounds generous, right? Sounds like a reward. You have served, you have bled, now go home and rest. Except he was replacing them with Persians. Alexander had spent years integrating Persian soldiers into his military. He had formed a unit, the Epigoni, which roughly translates to the successors of 30,000 young Persians who had been trained in Macedonian fighting style, drilled in Macedonian tactics, equipped with Macedonian weapons. They were good, they were disciplined, and Alexander, who loved efficiency and innovation above almost everything else, saw in him the future of his army, an army that was not ethnically Macedonian, not culturally Greek, but something new, something that belonged to the empire as a whole rather than any one people within it. To Alexander, this was progress. This was his vision of a unified world, a blended civilization where the best of every culture came together under one ruler. He genuinely believed this. You can read it in the speeches recorded by Arrian and Plutarch. Alexander talked about the brotherhood of mankind, about Persians and Macedonians as two halves a whole, about himself as the king not of one people but of the world. To his Macedonian veterans, this was replacement, this was erasure, this was their king, the man they had carried to glory on their backs, looking him in the eye and saying, "You are no longer what I need." And then came the order about the language. Now here's where historians get into it, because the historical record around the specific language edict is fragmentary. We do not have a single document that says, Alexander hereby bans Macedonian Greek. What we have is a pattern of behavior, a series of decrees and actions that together created an environment in which the use of traditional Macedonian language, titles, customs, and identity was systematically deprioritized, and in some documented cases, actively suppressed, in favor of Persian court language and custom. The Persian administrative language, Aramaic, was being pushed as the lingua franca of the empire. Persian titles were replacing Macedonian ones. Persian forms of address were being required in formal contexts. And for the soldiers, for men who had been speaking the same dialect around campfires for 10 years, men who cursed in Macedonian when they got hit, prayed in Macedonian when they were scared, sang Macedonian drinking songs when they were drunk, for these men, this was not just a policy. This was an attack on the soul of who they were. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from. Seriously, we have got people watching Sinister Empires from all over the world, and we love knowing where our crew is at. And if you have not subscribed yet, bro, what are you even doing? Hit that button and join the Empire. Because what happened next at Opis was not just a mutiny. It was a reckoning. The city of Opis sat on the Tigris River, in what is modern-day Iraq. It was there that Alexander gathered his army to announce the discharge of the veteran Macedonian soldiers, his official reasoning being that these men had served long enough and deserved to go home enriched and honored. He framed it as a gift, but his men had watched everything leading up to this moment, and they were not buying the gift wrap. They heard the announcement, and they erupted. The soldiers started shouting, not the disciplined, organized shouting of men making a formal complaint, but the raw, uncontrolled shouting of men who had been holding something in for too long and finally just couldn't hold it anymore. They told him to send them all home. All of them. They told him to go fight his next war with his father, meaning Ammon, the Egyptian god that Alexander had claimed as his divine father after visiting the oracle at Siwa. It was one of the nastiest things a Macedonian soldier could say to him, because it was a direct shot at the Persian god-king identity Alexander had been building for years. And Alexander, and this is the part that shows you who this man really was under the conqueror image, did not get defensive. He did not retreat. He did not try to smooth things over with promises or gold. He got absolutely furious. What Alexander did at Opis when his men started yelling at him was so unexpected, so bold, so genuinely unhinged by any normal leadership standard that it became one of the most analyzed moments in ancient history. He did not calm down. He did not call for order. He jumped down from the platform where he had been speaking, jumped down into the crowd, grabbed the 13 ringleaders with his own hands, pointed them out to his guards, and had them arrested on the spot, right there in front of the entire assembled army. Then he climbed back up and kept talking. He finished his speech. And the speech he gave was not an apology. It was not a negotiation. It was a full-on dressing down that lasted long enough for every man in that crowd to feel in their chest. He went through everything. He reminded them of what Philip had done for Macedonia before any of them were old enough to hold a sword. How Philip had taken a bunch of highland farmers and turned them into the most dangerous fighting force in the world. Then he went through his own campaigns, point by point, battle by battle, wound by wound. He described every scar he had taken in their service. He listed the places they had been, the armies they had beaten, the distances they had covered. And then he looked at them, thousands of men who had fought beside him for more than a decade, and he basically said, "You ungrateful sons of guns. You want to go? Go. I do not need any of you. I have got Persians now." The soldiers were stunned, not because the speech was unexpected. They knew Alexander had a temper, but because he meant it, every word. This was not a performance. This was a man who had genuinely shifted his sense of identity so far from his Macedonian roots that he could stand in front of his life's companions and tell them they were replaceable. And the terrible thing, the thing that cut the deepest, was that maybe he was right. He dismissed the entire Macedonian force and moved into his palace. He started conducting all business with his Persian court. He gave Persian officers the commands that had previously belonged to Macedonians. He adopted the full Persian court protocol in all official dealings. Persian bodyguards, Persian advisors, Persian generals running Persian troops. And for 2 full days, 2 days, he refused to see a single Macedonian soldier. The silence during those 2 days must have been extraordinary. These men, rough, battle-worn, proud warriors, sat outside the palace and stewed in what they had done. Because here's the thing about Alexander's play. It was working. The veterans knew that if they left, the empire would keep running. The Persian administrators already knew how to run it. The Persian soldiers were already trained. They were not indispensable anymore. That realization, that gut punch moment when a man understands he can actually be replaced, that broke them far more effectively than any battle ever had. On the 3rd day, the Macedonian officers came to the palace gates. They laid down their weapons and they wept. These are men who had charged Persian war elephants without blinking, men who had crossed frozen mountain passes in the dark, men who had watched their closest friends die in the dirt of foreign countries and kept moving. And they stood outside Alexander's palace, and they wept like they were never going to stop. Alexander came out, and when he saw them crying, when this man who had been holding his fury like a weapon looked at the broken faces of his brothers, he reportedly cried too. He came down to them, and he embraced his officers, and he wept with them. And the reconciliation that followed was one of the most dramatic emotional scenes in all of ancient history. A great banquet was held. Greeks, Macedonians, and Persians all sat together. Alexander prayed openly for harmony between the peoples of his empire. He spoke of a unity that was not just political but spiritual, a brotherhood of man that crossed every ethnic and cultural line. It was genuinely beautiful. And it was also, depending on how you read it, the moment Alexander's empire became something no single cultural group could ever fully claim as their own again, including the Macedonians. The soldiers who chose to stay were folded back into an army, now fundamentally different from the one they had joined. The language of command was shifting. The hierarchy was changing. Their culture, their customs, their way of honoring the dead and celebrating victories, all of it was being compressed, diluted, blended into something new. Some of them accepted this and served loyally until the end. Others accepted it on the surface, while the resentment smoldered underneath. And some left. They took their discharge and their gold, and they walked west, back toward a Macedonia they had not seen in years, carried with them a bitterness that would not die until the empire itself died. But here is what nobody talks about enough. The soldiers who left were not just leaving the army. They were leaving Alexander, the man, the king they had believed in so completely that they had followed him to the literal edge of the map. And in leaving, they were taking with them the last remaining thread of the original Macedonian identity that had held this whole thing together. Without that thread, the empire was not a living thing bound by shared identity and shared sacrifice. It was a machine, an efficient, powerful, beautifully engineered machine. But machines do not mourn. Machines do not love. Machines do not hold together when the man running them dies. Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BC. He was 32 years old, and within a generation, every single piece of his empire was being fought over by his generals, men who had been right there at Opus, right there at the Susa weddings, right there through all of it. The empire fractured exactly the way a machine breaks down when no one fully understands how all the parts connect. Now, let's slow down and really get into what was going on under the surface, because the Opus Mutiny and the language suppression are not just interesting historical events. They are a case study in one of the most dangerous traps that any powerful person, any leader, any empire builder, any organization can fall into. And understanding that trap is what makes the story genuinely relevant, not just to ancient history, but to every single structure of power that has ever existed. Alexander's genius was in synthesis. His whole approach to building an empire was not just conquest, it was integration. He did not just want to defeat Persia. He wanted to become Persia while remaining Macedonia, while expanding into India, while incorporating Egypt. He wanted to be everything at once. And for a while, for a genuinely remarkable stretch of years, he pulled it off because his personality was powerful enough to hold contradictions together. He could be a Greek philosopher's student and a Persian god king in the same afternoon. He could drink with Macedonian veterans at night and hold court in Persian ceremonial dress the next morning. His personal energy was the glue. But here's the problem with being the glue. When you are the only thing holding contradictions together, everything depends on you not breaking. And Alexander was breaking. Slowly, incrementally, in ways that the people around him could see long before he could. The death of Hephaestion in 324 BC, the same year as the Opus Mutiny, devastated Alexander on a level that went beyond grief. Hephaestion had been his anchor, his counterweight, the one person in Alexander's life who knew the king before the king existed, who had grown up with the boy before the boy became a legend. When Hephaestion died of illness in Ecbatana, Alexander's response was so extreme that it alarmed everyone around him. He refused food for 3 days. He reportedly lay on the body weeping for an extended period that made his generals deeply uncomfortable. He had the mane and tails of all the horses and mules in the army shorn in mourning. He ordered the battlements of nearby cities knocked down as a funeral gesture. He applied for divine honors for Hephaestion, a request so far outside the normal order of things that even the oracle at Siwa reportedly only granted him the status of a divine hero rather than a full god. This was a man in crisis, a man who had pushed himself and everyone around him to the absolute limit of human endurance, who had reordered the world according to his vision, and who was now sitting in a palace surrounded by people who were either afraid of him, manipulating him, or both. And the one person who had ever actually known him as a human being was dead. The language ban, the cultural suppression, the forced integration, all of these things take on a different quality when you understand that they were happening simultaneously with Alexander's psychological unraveling. Was the language policy a rational, considered strategy for imperial governance? Maybe, probably. Alexander was smart enough that most of his decisions had genuine strategic logic behind them. But it is also possible, and the historical record supports this reading, that some of what was happening was less about strategy and more about a man losing his grip on his own identity, trying to force everyone around him to lose theirs too. Misery, as they say, loves company. And the soldiers felt it. They felt the difference between Alexander the commander, the man who poured out water in the desert because he would not drink what his men could not drink, and Alexander God King, who sat in a Persian palace and conducted business in a language most of his veteran soldiers couldn't fully understand. The physical distance had become emotional distance, had become cultural distance. And the language, the specific, practical, daily reality of what words were used and which ones were pushed out, was the most visible symbol of all of it. Think about what language means to a soldier far from home. When you are exhausted and scared, the way you talk to the guy next to you is everything. The specific words you use for common things, food, weapons, the name you call your commanding officer, the curses you shout when things go sideways. Those words are not just communication. They are a chain of connection going all the way back to home, back to family, back to the version of yourself that existed before the war. Strip those words away, and you are not just changing how people communicate. You are severing that chain. You are telling a man that the version of himself that existed before the empire is no longer welcome here. And for what? For an empire that did not outlast its founder by more than a generation. The Didakai, the successors, Alexander's generals who divided the empire after his death, spent the next 40 years in near-constant warfare with each other. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took the eastern territories. Antigonus and Cassander fought over Greece and Macedonia. The grand unified civilization Alexander had sacrificed his army's identity to build was carved up like a birthday cake by the very men who had watched him build it. Every one of them understood that without Alexander as the living, breathing center of the whole project, there was nothing to hold it together. Because Alexander had made the empire about himself, his vision, his identity, his synthesis of cultures, rather than about any shared identity that could survive his absence. That is the real lesson of the language ban. Not that cultural integration is wrong. Not that empire building is doomed. The lesson is that when you try to build a new identity by destroying the old one rather than expanding it, you are not building anything. You are just tearing things down and hoping the new thing you put in the rubble is strong enough to hold. And in Alexander's case, the new thing was him, only him, and no man, however great, however chosen by whatever god you believe in, is strong enough to be the foundation of an entire civilization by himself. Hey, if you are still riding with us this deep into the story, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Go ahead and subscribe to Sinister Empires if you have not already. We are putting out content you genuinely cannot find anywhere else, digging into the moment of history that changed everything and nobody bothers to explain properly. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a drop. Let's talk about what happened after. Because the aftermath of the Opus Mutiny and the cultural suppression campaign is not just a footnote in the story of Alexander's empire. It is the story of the empire's ending, laid out in slow motion for anyone paying attention. Alexander died on June 10th or 11th of 323 BC in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. The cause of death has been debated by historians for literally 2,000 years. Typhoid fever complicated by excessive drinking is the mainstream theory, though poisoning has never been fully ruled out, and a more recent medical hypothesis suggests Guillain-Barré syndrome, a nerve condition that can cause a slowly progressing paralysis that might explain why his body reportedly showed no signs of decomposition for several days after death, leading his attendants to initially believe he was still alive. Whatever killed him physically, what really killed him was simpler and more brutal. He was 32 years old, and he had spent more than a decade destroying his own body in service of an ambition that had no natural stopping point. The man who once said that what he needed was more worlds to conquer had literally run out of worlds and had nothing left to push against. When he died, his generals immediately and predictably descended into chaos. The first question, who inherits the empire, was answered almost immediately with nobody, because nobody can. His half-brother Philip Aridaeus, who had cognitive disabilities and was never considered a real ruler, was propped up as a figurehead. His son, Alexander IV, was born posthumously to his Bactrian wife Roxana and declared co-king, but was a baby. Neither of these kings were real power. The real power was being divided in real time by a group of generals who had spent their careers watching a genius hold contradictions together through sheer force of will, and who now had to figure out how to hold things together without him. They couldn't. Of course they couldn't. Nobody could have. The wars of the Didakai, the conflicts among the successors, lasted from roughly 322 BC until about 275 BC. Nearly 50 years of warfare between men who had all once served the same king, all once fought the same battles, all once stood on the same ground at Opus and wept together. The empire was divided into what would eventually become the major Hellenistic kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia, and several smaller states. Each of these kingdoms was, in its own way, a fragment of Alexander's vision. Greek culture blended with local traditions, Macedonian military structure combined with local administrative systems. But here's the fascinating and deeply sad thing about these successor kingdoms. In every single one of them, the local culture, the culture Alexander had been trying to blend, absorb, and ultimately suppress in favor of his grand unified identity, survived and eventually reasserted itself. In Egypt, the Ptolemies initially ruled as Macedonian Greeks, but over generations became increasingly Egyptianized, eventually worshiping Egyptian gods, adopting Egyptian titles, and identifying more with the pharaonic tradition than with anything Macedonian. In the Seleucid East, the Persian and Mesopotamian administrative and cultural traditions that Alexander had tried to co-opt came roaring back. The cultures that Alexander tried to remake in his own image outlasted him. They outlasted his empire. They outlasted his dynasty. They are still alive today in various forms. While the Macedonian civilization Alexander had tried to transform beyond recognition faded into history, the Macedonian veterans who walked away from Opis went home to a Macedonia that had changed in their absence. Some of them found families who barely recognized them. Some found that the world they had left behind had moved on without them. The trauma of that kind of dislocation. Fighting for years in foreign lands, being asked to give up your cultural identity as the price of continued service, and then returning home to find that home itself had changed. That kind of trauma does not have a clean resolution. It festers. It passes down through generations. And in the case of Macedonia specifically, the instability created by the absence of so many fighting men for so many years, combined with the political chaos following Alexander's death, meant that Macedonia itself became a contested prize rather than a stable homeland. Cassander, one of the Diadochi, seized control of Macedonia and had Alexander's mother Olympias executed, had Roxana and Alexander IV imprisoned and eventually killed, and essentially wiped out the direct Argead dynasty that Alexander had come from. The house Alexander built consumed his own bloodline, his own legacy, and the men who had built that house with him. The veterans of Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, the survivors of the Gadrosian Desert and the Indian Campaign, the men who had wept at the gates of Opis. Most of them died in obscurity, their stories unrecorded, their sacrifice absorbed into the vast machinery of an empire that lasted a generation and then blew apart like ash in the wind. Now here is what I want you to sit with as we wrap this thing up, because this is a part that matters beyond ancient history. Alexander the Great is considered by many to be the most successful conqueror in human history. The numbers back that up. No individual before or after him conquered as much territory in as short a time, with as high a success rate in battle against as varied a set of opponents. He was, by almost any military metric, the greatest. And yet, the thing that undid him was not a foreign army. It was not disease, though disease ultimately killed him. It was not even his own excesses, though they accelerated everything. The thing that undid him was the failure to understand that the people who built his power with him, the people who bled for his vision, needed to remain themselves in order to keep choosing to build it. When you strip people of their language, their customs, their way of identifying who they are, you are not strengthening your power over them. You are creating a silence. And in that silence, loyalty dies. Not loudly, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, like a fire going out when you stop feeding it. The men of Alexander's army did not rebel and destroy him. They just stopped being fully there. They did what they were told. They performed their duties. But the piece of them that had once been willing to follow this man to the edge of the earth and beyond, that piece was gone, packed up and taken home, or buried in some foreign field they would never be able to name in their own language. And Alexander, brilliant, unstoppable, genuinely one of the most extraordinary human beings who has ever lived, died at 32 years old in a foreign palace, surrounded by people who served him, with the one person who had truly known him already dead, in a world he had remade so thoroughly in the image of his own vision that there was no longer a single corner of it that felt like home. That is not a victory. That is a warning. Dressed up in gold and purple robes, preceded by the thunder of 60,000 soldiers, written down in the histories of a dozen civilizations. But a warning all the same. This has been Sinister Empires. If this story hit different for you, if you felt something sitting with this history, then you are in the right place. This channel exists for the people who want to understand power, not just celebrate it. The people who want to know not just what happened, but why, and what it means for every structure of power that came after it, and every structure that exists right now. Subscribe to Sinister Empires if you are not already part of this crew. Hit the bell so you catch every new drop. We are not slowing down. There are 1,000 more stories just like this one waiting to be told, and we are going to tell every single one of them. And before you bounce, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Seriously, we have got folks watching from all across the United States, from the UK, from Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa, from places that Alexander himself once marched through thousands of years ago. Are you catching this from somewhere out in the Midwest on a late night? Watching from the East Coast before work? Tuning in from overseas on land that Alexander literally conquered? Drop your city, drop your country. Let us know you are out there. And tell us what part of the story messed you the most. Because that right there is how we build something that lasts longer than any empire ever did. We will see you in the next one.